Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. As you can tell from the chat, we have people here from all over the place. So I want to make sure that you know that we're in Massachusetts of the USA. I'm here with Evan Friss, who's going to be talking about the Bookshop, a history of the American Bookstore, which I have been looking forward to this for months as a book lover myself, as somebody who spent lots of times in libraries and bookshops when I was a kid. I have been, like I said, looking forward to this for a long time. So I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Before we get to Evan, though, I just want to say a couple of things. I want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. I'd also like to thank Evan for letting us share this program with a multitude of libraries, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, who all jumped on it because librarians are all book lovers, as you probably know. So thank you, Evan. I think when libraries work together, we just make magic. So this, of course, is that magical program. And you can buy signed books from Evan from Aesop's Fable, which is our local indie bookstore. They're fabulous. I will send or put that link in the chat at some point, as well as in a follow-up email to everybody. So you will not miss it if you want to buy the book. But of course, you can get it from your local library as well. And Evan has about a 15-20 minute presentation, and I'm going to turn the chat off during his presentation, but you can put questions in the Q&A at any time, which I'll be moderating to Evan after his slides. So feel free to ask any questions. I'll be moderating them. I have plenty of my own, though, if you're a slow starter. So Evan, welcome. I don't want to tell you too much about the book, because it's so good and you're going to tell us all about it. But I love the fact that your wife is a bookseller and your kids are part-time booksellers. How you get your kids to do that, I am very, very impressed. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and to everybody who's here virtually. I can't see you, but I appreciate you being here from all different places. I'm currently in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I'm a professor at James Madison University. It's located in the Shenandoah Valley, and it's pretty here, and the weather's nice. So I hope the same is true wherever you are. So I'm going to start by reading a bit from the beginning of the book, which I guess isn't the most original way to start a presentation, but um, it sets up a couple of things I want to talk about. So bear with me for a moment. 3 Lives and Company is on a corner in the West Village, New York City. Along the hand-carved wooden shelves, glowing under Jolly Rancher green colored lamps, there's fiction and non, frontless and backlist, picture books and cookbooks, art and architecture, Granta, graphic novels, the Paris Review, and all things New York. The dog treats are behind the counter. Toby, the owner, wears a soft gray beard and beanie, body surfs in the morning Atlantic, and drinks a Balzacian amount of coffee. Inside the shop, he's constantly layering, pruning, and rearranging. The colors, the scale, the feeling. No stacks too tall or too short or too crooked. Maybe it's all the coffee. Toby owns the bookshop outright, yet he doesn't think of it as his shop. He says he's a custodian. It's the bookshop, not Toby, that has a relationship to the customers. Likewise, Abel, who is so often found on the lone stool that it's now called Abel's stool. Dr. Gary, the rheumatologist who once diagnosed a bookseller with shingles over by the biographies. The Broadway composer who makes melodies from random lines and random books. And the parade of volunteers who help wrap in December and share popcorn tins and chocolate bars hidden under the counter are all known by the same title, Friends of the Shop. Sometimes loved ones will phone with news that a longtime customer has died. The bookstore ought to know. When customers send Christmas cards and snacks, they address them not to an individual. They are for the shop. Calling them customers doesn't even sound right, probably because many of them hardly ever buy anything. The quintessential shop around the corner is what makes the village feel like a village. It has charm, personality, soul. And more than anything, Toby doesn't want to screw it up. And so I start the book at Three Lives and Company because that was really the genesis for this book project. So I was in graduate school studying American history. I'm now, as I mentioned, a professor of history. And my then girlfriend and current wife came with me to New York and got a job somewhat randomly at this small magical bookshop. And it was really through her experience and her coming home and talking about the customers, celebrity sightings, the dogs that came in, but really the kind of people that animated this space that made me think about and wonder about just how important these bookstores could be as anchors to community. And also as a historian, was wondering about their evolution over time. How long have there been bookstores? How have they changed over time? And perhaps most importantly, why were they disappearing? Something that I, of course, witnessed over the course of my lifetime. So I was intrigued by this notion about the power of the bookshop and decided that I would one day write a book about them, which took, I don't know, 15 years or something. So I'm going to read some short snippets from the book, and I'll call them little tastes. And I use that term deliberately because back in the 18th century, Oliver Wendell Holmes described browsing at the Old Corner Bookstore, which I'll talk about in a moment in Boston, as book tasting. This is how he described browsing. Book tasting makes one hungry for more than he needs for the nourishment of his thinking marrow. The term browsing itself dates to the 15th century when it was first used to describe how cows and goats and other grazers munched on vegetation. So browsing a bookstore is like tasting, and I'm going to try and give you some tastes here. So this is the Old Corner Bookstore, which started in 1828 in Boston. In the building on the corner of Washington and School, editors clutched stacks of manuscripts, printers scurried about in ink-stained clothes, publishers flipped through invoices, and poets browsed shelves of verse. The writers who frequented the Boston bookstore, print shop, publishing enterprise weren't just the usual aspiring sort. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Harriet Beecher Stowe came to talk religion, music, theater, and philosophy. United States senators came to talk politics. Nathaniel Hawthorne preferred not to talk at all. Customers described the scene as a lounge, a resort, a place to learn about new books. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who regularly made the trip from Cambridge, delighted in the fact that the loiterers were also the makers of books. Not everyone was so famous. A sea captain, when not aboard, essentially lived in the middle of the shop floor on a stool. Anyone could walk in, browse, and start a conversation. The store was a de facto public space, a meeting space, a communal space that wasn't a house or church or political hall. In those cramped quarters, writers, readers, and literature cohabitated. It was intimate, it was far-reaching, it was alive, and it was at the center of a transformation, the birth of the modern American bookstore. And this is just an image of what it is today. The building's actually has been tremendously well preserved, but it's now a Chipotle. There is, however, a plaque that speaks to its distinguished literary history. And one of the reasons I profile this bookstore in the book, or I call it a modern American bookstore, is because it eventually became a place for people just to hang out. So many early bookstores, the books were protected. They were in cupboards or behind glass enclosures, or you had to talk to a clerk in order to get a book down from the shelf. But the Old Corner was part of this kind of new wave of bookstores where people could come, browse, or as Holmes called it, taste books themselves, pick them off the shelves, and more importantly, converse and talk with one another. So the idea of what a bookstore is has always been in flux, and I think it will surprise people. It certainly surprised me that the idea of a kind of corporate supersized bookstore is much older than Barnes and Noble and Borders. And in fact, for the first half of the 20th century, one of the most influential and admired bookstores wasn't even a standalone bookstore. It was a department store. In 1925, there were 164 bookstores in Chicago. One we might not think of as a bookstore at all, the Marshall Field and Company Book Department. Collectible sets of authors found on English lit syllabi huddled in the back. Poetry, art books, illustrated classics, and all things Louisa May Alcott lined the perimeter. Rare books, fine bindings, and a couple of sofas sat to the right. There was a counter for wrapping, a counter to ask questions about fiction, and a counter to ask any questions at all. Men in hats, women in hats, and children, sometimes in hats, browsed. The sales clerks, mostly women in high-collared dresses, waited on them. They didn't wear jewelry. They didn't bob their hair. The employee manual permitted only a business-like arrangement of the hair. Most importantly, they never wore hats. Hatlessness was how you knew who was working. The male sales clerks basically wore whatever they wished. Fields ordered books by the thousands. As an English essayist touring America in 1920 put it, the Marshall Field and Company Book Department is to ordinary English bookshops like a liner to a houseboat. In essence, Fields was the first bookstore superstore. And it benefited enormously from the scale and scope and resources of this behemoth department store that had 68 elevators and hundreds of thousands of feet of pneumatic tubing and 700 horses standing by, which they used to deliver books, same-day delivery. These are just some other images from the book department. They had a whole magazine section. One of the hallmarks of the book department was this kind of constant reshuffling and rearranging, often seasonal displays. So this is from a 1920s something Spirit of Spring exhibition. And one of the things that Marshall Field and Company popularized was bookstore events, author signings, and in one very famous case from 1944, an elephant who signed copies of her book. This is Judy here. The woman who ran the Marshall Field Book Department was named Marcella Burns Honor, and she and the next woman I'm going to talk about, Frances Stelloff, were two of the most influential booksellers in American history, and dominated the landscape for 30 or 40 years. So this is I'm going to read a bit from my chapter on the Gotham bookmark. Frances Stelloff sat at her alcove desk in the back of the shop. Customers coming to look for her, and they always did, might trip over one of the too many tables topped by too many books, or one of the novelists named cats. Even if they made it past furry Thornton Wilder and the oversized table up front covered with little magazines, and then through the maze of rare and first editions that stretched up, down, and across the shelves, and then past the experimental literature section with towers of books on the floor, walking by paintings, drawings, and photographs of Joyce, Pound, Wolfe, O'Neill, and others, and then past the books on cinema and the section devoted to theater, and then Stelloff's personal favorite, the room stuffed with religion and philosophy. They might still have trouble spotting her, a slight woman with steely blue eyes and wispy gray hair, sitting amidst a jungle of notes, files, letters, mailing lists, paper clips, receipts, bank statements, catalogs, rubber bands, and cups of cantaloupe. But if they did manage to find her, she, in turn, would find them the right book. Frances Stelloff was the Gotham bookmark, and the Gotham bookmark was Frances Stelloff. It was also a home, literally. Stelloff lived in the third-floor apartment, often slept outside on the balcony, and came bouncing down the stairs with a pencil tucked somewhere in her hair that she never fussed over each morning. But it was more than a home and more than a bookshop. It was a museum, art gallery, psychologist's couch, disheveled English professor's office, grandmother's living room, and Parisian cafe wrapped in one. And this is one of my favorite photographs I came across, which is her desk, which should make all of us feel much better about our own desks. So the Gotham Book Mart was this very artsy shop that catered to modernist literature, the avant-garde, lots of artists. And downtown in New York, for some of that period, were a collection of used bookshops that created essentially an entire neighborhood that became known as Book Row on Fourth Avenue. And you can see this is a map of a couple dozen of them. And basically, they all eventually went out of business, with one notable exception, the Strand. In 1975, clerks at the Strand earned $3.83 an hour. First, though, they had to pass a test. Applicants had to match 10 book titles with 10 authors, but there was always a catch. One title and one author had no match. Surely the guy working in the basement had aced the quiz. After all, he was known as Manhattan's most bookish man. He went by Bert Britton. Bert Britton adored Miles Davis, Scotch, and first editions, and lived in an Upper West Side apartment full of ashtrays and books that he wouldn't let guests touch. At the Strand, Britton, long hair, tight jeans, same leather vest, paced behind the rope of the Strand's underground. As people browsed, Britton never hesitated to correct the pronunciation of authors' names or their taste. It's just as easy to read something good, he would say, replacing the book in their hands with another. Britton seemed to know everyone. He'd take an author, Saul Bellow, for example, read his entire corpus, and then invite him to the Strand. Remarkably, they'd show up. Then Britton would tell them, as he told everyone, what they should read next. And before they left, he'd tell them to draw a self-portrait. They did that too. Britton had been collecting them for years and published self-portrait Book People Pictured Themselves in 1976, which included 739 drawings from Saul Bellow, James Baldwin, Joan Didion, who instead of drawing herself wrote a few lines of text, 5'2", too thin. The Strand held the book launch. Don DeLillo, Ralph Ellison, Kurt Vonnegut, and some 1,500 literary eggs, all in one basket, as the New Yorker described it, attended one of the all-time great literary parties, a party held for a guy who worked in the basement. One of the interesting phenomenons is that the Strand has made it now 100 years almost, and that's obviously a rare feat for a bookstore. And as we all know, there's been a kind of modern resurgence of independent book selling, and many of the indies around today have opened relatively recently, including Parnassus in Nashville, Tennessee. There's no single face of independent book selling, but if there had to be just one, it would be Ann Patchett's. It's a pretty face. She kind of looks like one of those pale New Englanders who rode crew at the Olympics while also working full-time as an oncologist. She's actually from Nashville and not terribly athletic, though she did once pass the LA Police Academy fitness test. And her writing career could be compared to a gold medal winning decathlete. She's written novels, memoirs, picture books, essays for the New Yorker, Harper's, and everywhere else writers wish they wrote for. There were no signs and seemingly no good reasons why she wouldn't stick to writing. Booksellers dream of becoming writers, not the other way around. But in 2011, Nashville, home to an admittedly eclectic mix of high and low brow, Vanderbilt and a Parthenon replica, the Grand Ole Opry and dive bars, Haute Cuisine and Hot Chicken, didn't have a single real bookstore. at least what Patchett considered to be real. So she plunked down $300,000 and began to change the narrative. The story of the independent bookstore was really a story in her telling of resiliency. And the last theme, and what I'll conclude this presentation before we open it up to questions, is really about the story that we tell ourselves about the narrative of bookselling history. Are bookstores multiplying or dying? And how do we think about bookstores has been influenced by, in many ways, popular culture. When I told people what I was working on, the most common response, other than when will you be finished, was in one way or another about the film You've Got Mail. Have you seen it? Yes. Are you going to write about it? Yes. Maybe you can interview Tom Hanks. Maybe. Aside from Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, Hugh Grant, Notting Hill, and Audrey Hepburn, Funny Face, both play memorable and unusually good-looking booksellers. Both find love rather than rare first editions. To be sure, these films are sappy and tropey, and many of the books about bookstores can also be dismissed as navel-gazing, like Hollywood's propensity to make movies about Hollywood. But there's a reason screenwriters and book writers love setting their stories in bookstores. They can be romantic spaces, places of discovery, of chance, of wonder. They can be community spaces, activist spaces, political spaces. And they can be places to get lost, to find oneself, to feel time slow. Whether in mysteries or memoirs, travel or true crime, romances or rom-coms, horror or history, bookstores can be more than just passive backdrops. Bookstores can be the actors. Bookstores, even the little ones, can shape the world around them. They already have. So that concludes my prepared remarks, and I very much welcome your questions.
Okay, we do have a couple from attendees, but I want to ask a couple first. First of all, I want to say that was beautiful. That as a librarian, I might have to cry for a little while later, but like I really do appreciate your perspective on books and the importance of books and being surrounded by books at any time in our lives. Um, your first two books were about cycling. How did you make this turn into bookshops?
Well, I think there are some maybe surprising similarities between the two, and I had a personal connection to both. So I was living in New York City, and I was often riding a bike around town. And as a historian, was wondering about the historic decisions that led to the urban landscape that I was encountering. So many of us decide to either, in New York especially, take the subway, or when are you going to drive, or when are you going to bike, based on what's easiest and what are the various constraints and costs and time and all sorts of other variables. So I felt like to some degree I had free will and could choose to get from A to B however I want. But it was also a list of choices that had been not preordained, but filtered, or at least governed by decisions made over time. And I did feel like bicycles in New York and in much of America at the time were marginalized to a degree. And I knew that there were other countries in which there was healthier cycling cultures. And so the parallel was I was living in New York and was wondering why all the bookstores were disappearing, or at least that's the narrative that I had heard, and was wondering about what kind of forces led to those changes. And I guess most simply, in my utopian romantic view of a city, there would be many more bicycles and bookstores, and that both of these things can actually enrich our individual lives and days, but also can actually make our communities and neighborhoods more vibrant and stronger.
Mhm. Wow. It's funny because Amy said the two places she has trouble leaving is a chocolate shop and a bookshop. So biking,
Well,
so much maybe.
yes. Well, I will say that Benjamin Franklin, the first chapter of the book, profiles his bookstore, which was a multifunctional space, and he was a printer as well as a bookseller. But one of his favorite things to advertise in the Pennsylvania Gazette was that he, in addition to almanacs and religious texts and Psalms and Aristotle, was, quote, very good chocolate. So this sounds like the bookstore for her.
Amy, you are not alone. Okay, so I just wanted to go, I'm going to go back to these questions, and I want to remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A because it's hard for me to follow in the chat, but feel free to chat with each other. I just opened up the chat to everybody again, if you'd like, and I'll kind of pay attention to that. Patty just wanted to confirm that you feel like there's been a boom in indie bookstores, maybe in the last decade or two.
So there's been a steep decline in the total number of bookstores, and that's evident over time. And our current, per capita number of bookstores is historically very low. On the flip side, the great decline and the precipitous decline certainly slowed. And in the last few years, there seemed to have been a slight revival. It is a bit hard to actually determine definitively, especially in any given year. How do you define what a bookstore is? The census says if it's more than a place that sells more than 50% of its revenue is derived from books, that it counts. The American Booksellers Association, which is the largest trade group, has a membership that comprises many, but not nearly all, of independent bookshops. But digging into the research actually can sometimes make things more cloudy and nebulous than one would hope. So it's certainly, I think we're in a stronger position today than we were, 5 or 10 years ago. And some of you out there probably are familiar with the news story anyway, that Barnes and Noble, I think, is opening 54 or something like that new stores this year after many, many years of contraction.
Mhm.
So I think that's an optimistic sign.
Mhm. I just want to piggyback on that question to ask if there was more indie bookstores that came about during and after COVID because people couldn't get out to get books.
Well, the immediate impact of COVID was actually much less severe in terms of the number of bookstores that went out of business. So, for good reason, pundits, booksellers, the American Booksellers Association, and all sorts of people rightly assumed that this would be a kind of death knell for large swaths of independent bookstores.
Mm.
And it was painful for many. But a lot of people rallied to support their local bookstore. Of course, there was government assistance, which helped too, and keep people on the payroll. But also, a lot of indie bookstores quickly established online platforms. And if you go around today, um, to a lot of bookstores, you can see which books they have in stock. A lot of them you can order online. And in many cases, this was set up out of necessity during the pandemic. So bookstores proved more resilient. There was a great uptick in reading and books purchased. A lot of that benefited, of course, Amazon and even Target and Costco and some of the other stores that were allowed to stay open because they were selling food and other necessary supplies. So they weren't forced to shut down like the local bookstore was, and they sold books and benefited from that as well.
Although I do have to say that, just on a personal note, that I think that libraries and indie bookstores sort of pivoted really well, as much as they could at that time. Brian says or asks, you discussed so many great bookstores in the book. What were some of your favorite bookstores that you researched that for one reason or another didn't make the cut? How did you select the stores that you did?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I ran out of time and space. And there's a line in the book where I apologize. It's something like, to you, dear reader, who thumbs through the index and finds no mention of your beloved bookstore, I'm sorry. But that's part of the point. The fact that people just open it up and look in the index and are hoping for their bookstore speaks to how important bookstores are to people compared to other kinds of retail establishments. So when I decided I would sort of structure the book, framing chapters around different kinds of bookstores, I wanted some balance in terms of different kinds of stores. Even though New York and Boston were centers of publishing, I didn't want all the chapters to be focused there. So I tried to provide some kind of balanced account. And a lot of it had to do with where I had sources. So I initially had some other ideas for different bookstores to profile, but I just couldn't find enough material. And sometimes it was just a kind of flow. But I did originally have a chapter on college bookstores, and I was profiling the college bookstore at Harvard, which was really fascinating and kind of influential bookstore. It still is. And was also looking at the seminary co-op, which is by University of Chicago. These kind of college bookstores, and the Harvard one in particular was interesting because a lot of the catalogs would suggest how you become a Harvard man. And it was reading Shakespeare, but also buying this blazer. And they were being sold kind of hand in hand. And as somebody who works at a university, who has been to many college bookstores that sell primarily sweatshirts these days, there was a kind of intriguing story about college bookstores once being intellectual centers on campus.
Mhm.
Uh, but I never wrote that chapter. And there's lots of other great bookstores that either get no mention or short shrift.
Yeah.
And you know, uh, I sort of knew that this was going to be a problem when I decided to write the book, and I did the best that I could. And
Yeah. Well, I will certainly be looking through the index for Aesop's Fable. Um, what type of history do you teach? Is it related to this?
well, I teach American history and I teach 19th and 20th century. I had primarily specialized in urban history. So, this relates in a way. One of the interesting things is, of course, bookstores have tended to congregate in populated areas where there were larger American cities, not just the total number of bookstores, but even on a per capita basis. There have always been more bookstores in New York and Boston and other places. So it is to some degree an urban phenomenon. This is what was an interesting change in the 1990s when Barnes and Noble and Borders started rolling out their superstores. And even in the 80s, things like B. Dalton and Walden Books and Crown Books, which were mall bookstores, really brought bookstores to the suburbs. And then, of course, it was Amazon that brought easy access to books from, anywhere basically in the country.
Mhm. Would you say this is my question. Would you say it's a fair assessment to say that indie bookstores really started declining when Amazon came onto the scene?
Well, there were First, I'll say that bookselling has always been a difficult business and never a terrifically profitable one for the average store. Margins are always low. They carry inventory that's constantly changing and coming in. They have the same product in our modern time that every other bookstore does. It's not like some specialty clothing retailer. And the prices are not really flexible. So the publisher, literally the book is, stamped with a price on it from the publisher. So booksellers um, don't have a whole lot of flexibility and have had lots of, constraints. And one of the themes of bookselling history is how precarious of an institution that it's always been. That said, the rise of Barnes and Noble and Borders, the fact that these were such large stores that were often offering the same books at a steep discount made it very difficult to compete. And the number of independent bookstores declined very quickly.
Mhm.
And then Amazon followed that. So there was the superstores, there was ebooks, there was Amazon, and they're all created, um, really stiff competition that proved formidable and that many people thought posed an existential threat to brick and mortar booksellers
Mhm.
in general.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the questions from our audience, but I do want to at some point talk about programming because when you were talking about that superstore with the programming, I was really curious about that because libraries have really done a lot of that as well. But I'm going to go
Yeah.
back to the questions so we can get to as many as possible. Larry asks, do bookstores in other parts of the country have a very different character? Larry, if you want to just say if you mean like in on the West Coast, like different from where? So I'm going to move on to Mary's question. I'm in love with bookstores and books, and I wonder what your response is to the book banning across our country.
Well, I think it's we before we got on the public call, we were just talking about how difficult it is to be a librarian today. Not that it's ever been an easy job, but the kind of decisions that Mina and other librarians are making across the country have now become so public and charged and with lots of eyeballs and lots of people, not all of whom are the most knowledgeable, weighing in about various kinds of decisions. So um, I do lament just how polarized, everything has become, including the landscapes of librarianship. And the same holds true for bookselling. And you'll see at many independent bookstores entire bays devoted to banned books. They're leaning into the books that are being banned, and oftentimes those books have exceptionally high sales numbers because they've been targeted by certain groups. So there's always been questions about the political nature of bookselling. Benjamin Franklin spurred Thomas Paine to come to the United States and write Common Sense and sell it. And that was a radical text that lots of people had problems with and honestly helped foment the American Revolution. And throughout the 19th century, there's lots of censorship going on. Frances Stelloff, who I mentioned, who was the founder of the Gotham Book Mart and worked there until she was 100 years old, was part of the avant-garde and was interested in promoting works that the censors thought were too lewd and obscene. Henry Miller and other kind of authors that many American scholars would later call geniuses and part of this kind of new form of literature. But people at the time labeled it pornographic. So she really stretched the boundaries and would often sell things that were illegal, including James Joyce's works, long before they were considered above board. So challenging censors, challenging people who are trying to ban material isn't new in the bookselling world, but it certainly has become louder. And of course, in our internet age, it's easier for everyone to have a kind of voice and to kind of share stories of, potential harm that books are doing. And booksellers and librarians have jobs that are hard enough. And I I just worry it's going to discourage more people from doing these great services and becoming, professional booksellers and librarians because they don't want to have to deal with the kind of flack that comes along with it.
Yeah, there's definitely concerns. So back to Larry's question about bookstores in different parts of the country. He basically wants to know if there's like differences between like East and West, New England and Texas, different, are they very, very different across the country?
Yeah, I think historically there's been regional differences to be sure. And even if I think it's less pronounced today and we live in a kind of more national culture, but if you look back in time, I think reading preferences and bookstores the distinctions might have been more pronounced 100 years ago or 150 years ago than they were today. I mean, of course, if you go back to kind of the early 19th century, I have a bit about Southern bookstores in the book, and people in the North are reading very different kinds of material. So it's not just the character of the bookstore, it's also the titles that are in stock.
Mhm.
And then there's some things about design. There are a lot of on the West Coast and warmer climates, there were more outdoor bookstores, or at least bookstores that had stalls outside. There were some in New York too, and I write about
Mhm.
some of the book, as well as bookmobiles. But there also used to be, I think, also just a greater diversity of kinds of bookstores, so much more specialty shops that are harder to run now.
Mhm.
But there are still, of course, bookstores that focus on cookbooks, and there's been a new wave of, romance-centered bookstores. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were activist bookstores, bookstores that started to cater to gay customers, feminist bookstores, Black bookstores, mystery bookstores, wine bookstores, oceanography bookstores, map, bookstores, all sorts of specialty shops. And some of those had kind of regional distinctions to them. So, like you might have a bookstore that specialized in books about wine and culinary things in, Sonoma Valley, that kind of thing,
Mhm.
and books that focused on urban kinds of matters in New York City, or books that dealt with kind of those kind of regional maybe interest, or at least particular to a kind of setting it was in.
Yeah, I think that that makes a lot of sense in terms of knowing your community. What do they want and getting it to them. I'm
Yeah.
going to put some of the questions together because we've got some similar themes or comments. So one of the questions is about diversifying in bookstores. So something like Barnes and Noble. I always bought my like toys and stuff for Christmas presents at Barnes and Noble. They had like the best. Was that like a marketing plan on their part to like really go away from books at one point?
So as I mentioned, Ben Franklin was selling chocolate. So people from the beginning, some of the first booksellers were selling sugar and wine. Because have always been a low margin business, it's never been uncommon for booksellers to sell other goods simultaneously. In today's world, they're called sidelines, and they have become a more central part of a bookstore. I think the last stats I saw were that the average bookstore sells 70 something percent of their revenue comes from books, and 20 something percent comes from non-books. And that could be mugs and socks and wrapping paper, Lego in the case of Barnes and Noble. One of the things that the current CEO of Barnes and Noble, his name is James Daunt, and I interviewed him for the book. He said he was trying to cut down on the sidelines and really wanted to make sure that everyone who walked into Barnes and Noble felt like they were walking into a bookstore. And I think
Mhm.
we've all been in shops where whatever the line is for us about how book heavy it needs to be, where the line's been crossed and it feels a little too much of tchotchkes and whatever else, that something feels off. But there are bookstores that have leaned into sidelines, which tend to be higher margin goods as a way to stay profitable, as well as other kinds of of ways of drawing other kinds of people into the shop. So
Mhm.
surely you've heard of, bookstores that are also wine bars, or that are selling beer there at night and trying to, maximize revenues while paying the same amount in rent.
Yeah, I'll go to any bookstore that has a high tea. I
All right,
haven't seen
you heard
anything.
it here first. If you open one, invite Mina there.
That's right. I haven't seen any, so yes, please invite me.
Okay.
We have a bunch of questions about author visits. So, like you were talking before we started about doing this book tour for your books and going to a bunch of bookstores and libraries and doing podcasts and things like that. But Is that something that has become very popular in bookstores in terms of, does it help their margins? What does it do for them?
Yeah, so for much of bookselling history, there was a gulf between the author and the reader, and the authors were distant, invisible figures. And Marshall Fields helped popularize this author signing, and they brought in some well-known authors. This was in the 1920s and 30s, and the publishers were like, "Do we want to do this or not? Is it going to be weird? Is it going to kind of ruin some of the appeal of not knowing this person, when they enter a room and they are just a regular person or they smell bad or whatever, is that going to be a turnoff for the customer?" But the opposite happened, that the authors were, I think the line that one of the Marshall Field executives used was they were made more human. And that the readers loved it, and they loved meeting authors, and they would come to hear sometimes authors they didn't know, and the booksellers found it was a reliable way to draw a crowd, so to get bodies into the bookstore. And in our modern times, especially post-COVID, once social distancing rules eased, booksellers have returned to doing whatever they can to drum up sales, to get people in the door, which often means a diverse group of kind of events, author talks, author conversations, author signings, of course, being part of that. But a lot of bookstores are doing very creative things, having book clubs, sometimes just having somebody come play the flute and you can come, listen to them in a kind of mini performance. People who are getting married in bookstores during off hours, whatever they can do to draw people in. And it's a kind of mixed bag, whether or not it helps. There are many bookstores, successful ones, that have events almost all the time, draw a big crowd, and it's a regular source of revenue. But for bookstores that are off the beaten path and can have a harder time drawing in some of the bigger name authors, it can be a lot of work on the staff of the bookstore and not necessarily a large payoff or a big crowd. And there are lots of authors out there. Some are independently published who want to do events and are, if you own a bookstore, then you are certainly are well aware of how many people there are, because they will come knocking on your door, understandably, and ask to do an event. And it's a kind of can be an awkward situation for the bookseller who doesn't think that anybody's going to show up or they're going to sell any copies, but they want to support a local author. So what do they do? And it can be difficult.
Yeah, we have the same issue with libraries too. We want to support authors, but we want to make sure that, you know, people come.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the question about that Larry had about different kinds of bookstores in different places, because your book was focused only on American bookstores. Stephen asks, did you look at bookstores globally at all, and the effect of American bookstores globally or other countries' bookstores on us?
Yeah, not much. I was saving that for the sequel, unless somebody else wants to write it. Um, honestly, writing the history of like the bookstore in America seemed so daunting to me. And originally, I was thinking about doing something smaller, like focusing on a couple bookshops or one city. So it kind of blew up to all of American history. And I did think about how much to include international stories, and there's very little in the book, with a couple of exceptions. So I talk about in Paris, Francis Steloff has a friend at Shakespeare and Company, this famed bookstore, and there's a connection between these two women at the center of modernist literature. But for the most part, it's really focused on American history. I have learned some about some of the cultures of bookstores and book selling in other parts of the world, but not enough to speak intelligently about that. And that's assuming that I'm speaking intelligently about the American bookstores. But certainly, however intelligently I'm speaking about American bookstores, the rest of the world would be a much poorer version and articulation of that story.
So far, I've been impressed, so you're okay.
Okay.
Um, I've had two questions that go straight to your index on if you could speak at all about Powell's bookstore in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, Powell's is in the index.
Okay.
Um, and I do write about. That was actually one of the bookstores that I thought about devoting a whole chapter to. But it just didn't work out. But Powell's and the Strand are the two most famous independent bookstores in the country.
Mhm.
And when people think about, for the most part, independence, that's what they think about. When tourists come from other countries, they will often descend on these institutions. And, if you're in Portland, it's kind of a rite of passage to go to Powell's. And
Mhm.
I did that. I did that kind of trip myself, and it's an amazing place. One of the other interesting things about Powell's and the Strand is they're both also now third generation. The Strand is third. I think Emily Powell is either the third or second generation, but they're both family businesses that have maintained this business within the family and have become these giant used bookstores. They also both sell new books now too,
Mhm.
uh, and are have managed to become tourist destinations. Have managed to become the indie brand, and it's amazing. You can go if you go to my book was published by Viking. If you go to the Penguin Random House website and you look up the book, they have these little buttons of where you can buy the book. Amazon, bookshop.org, Barnes and Noble, and then Powell's, which
Mhm.
is, of course, very different than those other entities, but they've managed to, make a really national household name
Mhm.
for themselves.
Lisa mentioned that Dash and Lily, the book and the Netflix show, did a great job of showcasing the Strand. I would agree with that.
Yes, I did see that.
Okay. Diane asks, did you find that there are certain characteristics or features of a particular any bookstores that made them more likely to endure? Was there something about them that was a clue that they might make it, long term?
Yeah, it's hard to say that there's any kind of magic formula because if I knew it, I would tell everybody. I will say a lot of it has to do with real estate, and nobody wants to think about the kind of cold calculations of business. But one of the remarkable things about the Strand and some of the other bookstores that have made it a century is that they at some point bought the building that they're in. So the Strand owns this amazing building on the corner of Broadway in New York City that it must have been Fred Bass bought many, many years ago. And so that is often an asset that appreciates over time and relieves some of the burden of escalating rent, which has been a problem. Um, but for other cases, like I talked about Three Lies, which started in the 1970s. So, that's been around a very long time. And the owner doesn't own the building, and its success is just that its customers love it, and there's a kind of brilliance in its simplicity. So it doesn't sell any sidelines other than maybe a tote bag or two, but it's basically all books. It's a small shop, which is also helpful oftentimes in terms of how much you can sell per square foot. Bigger stores have had a harder time historically. And there's no social media presence at Three Lives. They don't actually do a ton of events, but it's in, an affluent neighborhood in Manhattan, and its neighbors just love it and love delighting in the kind of charm and simplicity of it and have for almost 50 years running.
Mhm. I wanted to say one thing about sidelines, which is kind of curious because I've noticed there's places that have books as a sideline. Like there's a little cafe in Holliston, the town next to me, that they're a cafe, but they have a whole wall of books that you can buy. And
Yeah.
then there's a restaurant in Connecticut called the Traveler or something like that. People can mention it in the chat if they know it, that it's a Traveler and it's a restaurant, but it's in like they're just
Mhm.
covered with books all around them. And you can
Yeah.
pick out a book as you're eating. Super
I've
awesome.
seen there's a place called Busboys and Poets where there's a couple locations in the DC area,
Mhm.
which I'm familiar with. It's a similar thing. And I think, books, during the pandemic, everybody had their shelfies like this. People still like arranging books for decor.
Mhm.
And there's been a little this is not me, the historian, but Evan, just a guy living in the 21st century world, being kind of nerdy is embraced and maybe is cooler than it used to be and hipper. And there's like, you know, having a little section of books in a hotel lobby or in a restaurant can elevate, I think, the setting and makes it seem cooler in a way, even if um, people aren't reading them. But there's some kind of, a bookishness been trending to some degree, I think, and you see that in these kind of spaces, and
Mhm.
cool looking spaces often are also outfitted with some books. And that's not a new thing, by the way. Books as material objects goes back hundreds of years. People were buying books in the 19th century to make themselves look smart, to put them out on coffee tables and all the rest.
But there's a huge difference between trying to look smart and being cool. So I like
That's
that you think
true.
it's cool. They have books out.
Yeah,
Um,
books are cool.
they are cool.
Physical books, it's cool. It's like, vinyl records, or like, let's get some books in here and, make
Love
it cool.
it. So talk about shelf fees. Somebody asked me, said, all right, there's a large number of books in your bookshelves. How many books do you purchase in a year? What are your go-to favorites? And in terms of genres, and how much time do you spend in bookstores generally?
Well, I do have a lot of books. I'm a historian, and we are a very book-centric field. We write them and we read them. And I go to the bookstore all the time because, and you mentioned this at the beginning, but my wife owns a bookstore now. It's called Parentheses Books here in Harrisonburg. And she was the inspiration for this project. We moved from New York and she was not working for many years and decided she was going to open her own small shop. And many people thought she was crazy. Um, I wasn't so sure, but she's opened this great shop, and so I pull occasional shifts there, and spend a lot of time in this bookstore and buy a lot of books as well. And although I'm a historian and don't tell any of my colleagues around here, I'm in my office. Nobody's here. It's 8 o'clock at night, but I much prefer to read fiction. And, maybe it's a kind of obvious, but I just think it helps me become a better writer. I mean, first of all, I enjoy it more, but even as a historian who wants to tell stories in an entertaining way with a little bit of flair and detail, um, it's almost more useful for me, I think, to read a lot of fiction than nonfiction, or at least history.
Mhm. I'm just gonna ask a couple more questions if you don't mind hanging around because people are in the chat talking about the Traveler,
Sure.
and now I feel like I need to go there very soon. If you're ever up here, Evan, you have to go to this place.
Okay.
It's in, like I said, it's in Connecticut. It's amazing, and I've heard the
Okay.
food is.
Where in Connecticut is it?
It's right on the border of Massachusetts and
Okay.
Connecticut. In somebody help me out. No, it's not closed. It's somebody I know just went there recently.
Okay.
Union.
Well, I'll look it up.
Yeah, it's in Union,
Yeah.
Connecticut. Um,
Okay.
People want to know if digital or ebooks have adversely affected indie bookstores because it seems like the platforms Kindle and Nook and are the ones that you can actually buy ebooks from. And you can get them
Yeah,
from the library. Don't forget, you can get ebooks from the library.
that is true. Yeah, when the Kindle started to take off and the rate at which people were adopting ebooks, everybody just assumed this would be the end of the bookstore as we knew it. And even there'd be some diehard holder-ons who were just kind of stuck in their ways and would stick to these printed books, but that these would be cheaper. You could have thousands of them in your pocket. This was the future. And it did dent book sales tremendously. It was one of the reasons that Barnes and Noble and Borders suffered because Barnes and Noble came out with its Nook, but it was way behind the Kindle, and it was really eating into a lot of its print sales. But something very surprising happened, which is basically that the number of users plateaued. and it reached a kind of saturation point and didn't keep increasing at the same rate or even at all. And it's been kind of steady. And in more recent years, it's been audiobooks that have had an increase in popularity. And sure, if everybody reads ebooks and everybody listens to books, then bookstores as we know them aren't going to exist. There are ways to support your local bookstore through Libro FM, which is a kind of bookshop.org model where you can, listen to buy audiobooks through them, and a portion of the proceeds returns to your local bookstore. And there are a lot of people who just prefer listening to books, and there are obviously a lot of benefits to ebooks, which I, understand.
Mhm. One last question, which I think is kind of interesting because they're asking both of us, is do we think that Book Talk or TikTok have helped bookstores and libraries by growing readers, especially younger readers? Have you found that social media has had an effect on people buying or checking books out?
I think it helps certain genres, and it has certainly moved certain titles that have been, book talked enough to make a difference. And that the whole social media book world is an interesting one. And now that I have a book out, have been exposed to it. And there's a lot of, you can connect, the day that my book came out, all these booksellers very kindly just on social media every Tuesday go out and say, these are the new great books coming out. Check it out. And I was like, this is amazing. They're just, helping to sell my book and tell people about it. And that would be very hard to do without social media. Um, but there's also this kind of, again, fetishization of books on a lot of social media accounts. In the book, I call it book porn, of like this whole kind of motif of book filled spaces that people are really into, which is great and looks cool. But I don't know if it's leading to like deep reading or people sort of paying attention. And then there are these weird, you may have seen on social media, like the publishers will take a book, and put it next to a cup of coffee and a croissant and make this kind of like tempting tableau of what the book is, which is just to me like a funny kind of genre of social media. And I haven't done it yet, but I'm tempted to do like a mock version of that and put my book, like on the toilet or like next to like, dust and hammers or something. I don't know. In the real world, it's not always so pretty, and reading doesn't have to be. You have your book, wherever it is. But I understand the idea is like this cozy, charming feeling that you're trying to capture and the ambiance through this imagery. But it's become almost a kind of trope in some way. And I just think it's kind of funny. But
It is. It's definitely the mood board of books,
yeah,
those kind of
mood
things.
board. That's a good phrase for it.
You can use it in your next book, Evan.
All right. Thank you.
Which reminds me, before we go, I have to ask, is there something else on your plate? Are we expecting another book from you? Although this one just came out, so no pressure.
Uh, yeah. I'm thinking about it and I have some ideas, but I'm not ready. I'm not ready to talk about it. And I'm trying to stay focused and enjoy, not that it was a bad question, but I'm trying to appreciate this launch and love this opportunity to connect with readers. So, feel free to email me. There's nothing better than hearing from people who've read the book and trying to, talk about this book as much as I can before um, worrying about the next one, which I have a natural tendency to do. So,
Well, I think we're, obviously we are huge book lovers in this group and really appreciate the time that you took to educate us on something that we truly love. So I appreciate your time tonight, as well as all of your thoughtful comments and answers to so many wonderful questions. So thank you all for being here with us and for engaging with us around something that we all love to, like books and bookstores and libraries. So I hope you all have a wonderful night and happy reading, and go to your indie bookstores and your local libraries and do your thing, Cry, rally, cry.
Yes,
Evan, thank you.
thank you so much for having me, and I echo that completely. Nobody ever regrets spending time in a library or a bookstore. So,
Nobody,
head to
except
your
except
local
when you,
institutions.
except when you walk out with like like 10 books and a pound of chocolate.
That's good. That's good. That's all you need.
That's right. It's true. Life is done. You're good. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you, Evan. Oops, where's the end? Oop, there we go.